Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for making time. This is great. I'm really looking forward to having this opportunity to have a conversation with you about regenerative practice, because I think you're among less than a handful of people that I would say really have a depth in and lineage of having worked with this for 30, 40 years. And it's something that a lot of people don't even realize, because it's such a buzzword at the moment that me included didn't realize how long the lineage of the Regenesis Institute and Regenesis Group and Carol's work had actually been stewarding a whole set of, you like to call it technologies, a set of frameworks and tools of working with people on helping them regenerate their places and their relationship to place, and unleash their personal collective essences or potential in the service to a larger whole, as I have understood it. So how did you get into this work? Because you started off as an artist and also as a permaculture landscape gardener a few decades ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I studied humanities, and then I trained to become a painter and an artist. But very early on, I realized that I needed to take that training and apply it to design if I was going to make a living. And I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is, it's right at the interface between kind of dry desert grasslands and mountains, high mountains, the Rocky Mountains. And so it's a kind of harsh place. And learning how to garden here and how to do landscape design and so on is challenging. Luckily, I grew up in, my stepmother was a botanist, and she started the first native plant nursery here in New Mexico. And so I grew up sort of learning how to work with native species, collect the seeds, grow them, and so on. And that was where I really started out. I was always a gardener and always interested in design. But the impulse behind doing that native plant work was, how to bring the way we live in this very kind of fragile and challenging landscape, how to bring it into harmony with that landscape, using native species and so on. So that's really where I launched. And I'd always been a big fan of Rodale and the Rodale Institute and so on. And through that, I became aware of permaculture right when the first book was published in the 70s, maybe. So I was tracking it, but sort of very busy with my little, career. And then at some point in the mid 80s, I actually met Bill Mollison, and he was a big, charismatic megafauna kind of guy. And he sort of swept up a bunch of us in New Mexico and also in Arizona. And within a year, we had formed something called Permaculture Drylands Institute, which was focused.
With Joel, or was Joel already involved in that?
Well, Joel and I went to the same college, so we knew each other when we were like kids, really.
No, no.
Joel Glanzberg and I, yeah. And we had been friends, and he worked with me in my landscape company for some years. And then he went off and specialized in organic agriculture. That became his focus for a while. And we came back together around the permaculture work, along with other kind of, Tim Murphy, who was practicing in southern Arizona with his wife, Vic Marvin, and Scott Pitman, who was based near Santa Fe, and so on. At any rate, it was kind of an interesting Wild West period in the permaculture movement. And here in North America, there hadn't been a lot of work yet in drylands. So we formed to really focus on drylands, which meant that a lot of what we were interested in was how Mollison and Holmgren were thinking about water in relationship, managing water and soil in relationship to establishing permanent productive landscapes. And I got very, very involved in that, spent some years, teaching and designing and working in the field.
So
And
mainly doing contract work for designs for people, landscape,
yeah,
and so on, and then doing permaculture PDC courses and
yeah,
demonstration
both.
sites and that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as our experience grew, and I've teamed up with other people, and as our experience grew, both on the teaching side and on the consulting side, we were able to take on larger and increasingly sophisticated projects. So we started out working, people's backyards, that kind of stuff, and small farms. And it grew, especially after we met and started working with, now it's Max. His name's gone out of my mind. He was one of the first village developers.
Max Lindiger.
Max Lindiger, thank you. In Australia, we brought him over a few times to New Mexico to teach. Yeah, and at that point we started getting really excited about village design and taking on larger and larger development projects, campus development, and so on. And at some point, I felt like I hit kind of a wall. This is a very long-winded way of sort of saying that.
Interesting.
Regenesis grew out of the two schools of thought, really, about what regeneration is. And so one of those schools of thought, one of those streams of thinking came out of Robert Rodale's work, and then especially Bill Mollison, and to some extent people like Fukuoka. And so there was a whole group of people around the capacity of human beings to live as collaborators and enablers of the potential of natural systems. Right? And that whole school of thought was working on regeneration. Mollison made the distinction between degenerative, generative, and regenerative investments, he called it. And of course, Robert Rodale was really starting, when he died, he was right in the middle of a deep investigation into what is regeneration and what's it all about. And so that was very, very influential for me, when I was younger. And but I kept sort of bumping up against a wall, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. But at the time, the way I described it is, we can understand how to design these complex biomimetic landscapes, but the people that we're designing them for, whether they're individuals or communities or institutions, don't know how to live in them. And so the wall it was a wall or a ceiling maybe that I kept hitting up against was the capacity of the people that or the systems we were designing for. Mm. And I realized that, so my kind of default was, well, let's just train them up in permaculture and then they'll get it. But it wasn't working. It wasn't enough. And as a result, a fair number of the projects that we designed either never adequately got implemented, or they would be implemented, but then people didn't know how to grow and evolve and change with them.
Yeah, I mean, the list of examples, as you were describing this pattern, I was just thinking of BedZ in London, where they tried this Beddington Zero Emissions Initiative, an urban eco-village in the middle of London, and they had it all planned out with One Planet Living, people involved in this architect Bill Dunster. And once people moved into these structures, you could see that they hadn't thought of the social dimension of it and how to onboard people behaviorally and how to live in them. And so some of it worked and some of it didn't work. And
I was really absorbed in, or really interested in, a project in California called Village Homes that was also a real
Davis, California. Yeah.
In Davis, yeah, it was a pioneering project. Bill Mollison was very enthusiastic about it, and so you had a bunch of permaculture people associated with that back in the 70s, I guess. And it was the same thing, right? Very sophisticated in terms of land use and management of resources and solar design and layout of parking and so on, but not sophisticated enough about the design of the culture and governance process that would allow people to not only live harmoniously with what was built, but to actually continue to evolve it. And as a result, it started really sometime in I guess it was in the early 90s. I went back there with a group to have a look at it. I'd been so swept away by it when I first visited, and it was really dispiriting. The way all of the fundamental premises of the design were being slowly dismantled by second and third generation owners, because there was no culture to sustain it, to evolve with it. So that was the problem, the way I was seeing it at the time. And in the middle of all of this, I met up with Bob and Pamela Mang, who had been deeply immersed in another stream of thinking about regeneration that you alluded to earlier, that has also been around since the late 50s, really, and it had its roots in the work of people like David Bohm and J.G. Bennett and people like that. And they were interested in the application of regenerative principles to community, culture, organizational design and development. And they were part of a group that were one of the most pioneering networks of practitioners of organizational development back at the birth of that movement. Studying with a guy named Charlie Crone, who did really sophisticated work in some very large companies. And when we met, they immediately recognized that we were working on something that was missing in their work, that felt like they needed it. And we immediately recognized that they had something that we were missing, which could address this ceiling that we kept bumping into. And after, I don't know, a couple years of talking about it and doing projects and trying things out, we decided to come together and form Regenesis to see if we could integrate or create something new out of bringing these two schools of thought together.
Was it just simply coincident, or the luck of Pamela also being in New Mexico, or how did you actually meet?
It was kind of weird. I had been working, I spent 4 years working on a really kind of massive project. It was like a retreat center, but very exclusive retreat center at the former home of Georgia O'Keeffe, actually, when she lived the last part of her life. She was in Santa Fe. And Pamela brought a group called the World Business Academy there that had all these kind of luminaries. And that's where we met. And I took this group that she had brought there around and exposed them to what we were doing and the underlying philosophy of it, and sort of the whole systems thinking involved in a garden, right? And we had very deliberately designed that project to have this effect. It was, the retreat center hosted very high level conferences and gatherings, but in order to use it, they had to agree to go out and walk the grounds with, some member of the team that was working there on the grounds, so that they could be exposed to living systems thinking in practical application. And so I would take these groups around and talk to them about how all of these things work together. And after half an hour, they'd just be like lit up, ecstatic, because they could immediately translate what was functioning as a metaphor for them, right? They could, these practical applications in concrete material terms, they could see how it applied to whatever they were working on. Policy, business transformation, whatever, cultural questions. And so it was through that interaction that she invited me to dinner. She said, wow, that was really cool. Come meet my husband. We hit it off. I introduced them to my colleagues, and like I said, over a couple-year period, they attended permaculture courses to find out what we were doing, and by the end of it, we had decided to form Regenesis.
And we at that point, like we was your outfit with Joel Glanzberg, or the still the Permaculture Drylands Institute?
Well, I was still very involved in the Institute. Joel was also a faculty member for the Institute. He had his own little institute going out at one of the Native American pueblos nearby. So he was pursuing his own line of work. He was primarily interested in kind of agricultural application, and especially in indigenous communities, right? So that had been his focus. Whereas we were trying to figure out how to influence, we, meaning Tim and I and several other colleagues, were trying to figure out how to shift development patterns. And we weren't so much working on urban systems at that point. It was more like suburban or village development, that kind of thing. And but we continued to work together through the auspices of being friends and being in the Permaculture Drylands Institute. It wasn't until we formed Regenesis that it sort of pulled us all back together under one roof, bringing 10, 15 years of experience from these different specialties we'd all gone out and tested in terms of the application of permaculture or the application of this regenerative thinking in organizations. And when we came together, we had huge ambitions about really shifting the paradigm with regard to development.
So you specifically said, okay, what are we going to work on? And then looked at the development sector and then actually went out to pursue developers to work with you on new projects.
Yeah, I mean, it made sense. That had been our field,
yeah.
Right? Was land use. Even Bob, although he's part of that network, his primary focus had been, first of all, in land development, and then secondly, working at very large scales on the impact of development and how do you create governing structures and systems to manage development kind of at urban and larger scales so that it was beneficial and not destructive.
And I just, as you were speaking, because all of this is happening in New Mexico, or not all of it, but you meeting, I just suddenly thought, what have the overlaps been over the years with the sort of tribe that is stewarding the pioneers, and also when they did their Dreaming New Mexico projects in the, when was it? Actually, that's much more recent.
Yeah, that was the early 2000s, I think.
Yeah.
So we were
right.
always friendly with those guys, and we actually did some work. We did a story of place process with them on their property outside of Santa Fe, and over the years, a number of us have spoken at the big pioneers conferences and so on. And then when they put together the Dreaming New Mexico project, we hosted that. Actually, they set up an office inside. We had a kind of complex of offices where a bunch of different, kind of like-minded organizations shared the space together. And so Dreaming New Mexico set up its offices inside of our little complex. And we worked with them on it quite a bit, especially in the initial stages, around conceptualization. So yeah, there was a lot of kind of cross fertilization and interaction in those early years. At some point, Regenesis became much more global in its, once we'd really established ourselves, we started getting called to do work all over the world. And so Santa Fe, and it had always been difficult, it's that, prophet in his hometown kind of thing. It had always been difficult to find work or to be taken seriously here in our own backyard. It's partly, New Mexico is very, very poor. And so there's just not all that much opportunity. So we took a stab at it. I mean, we worked in a lot of institutions and continue to work in institutions in New Mexico, but it's a slow process.
like in order to, for me to get a more palpable sense of a large client, in that, like, as you were beginning to find work all over the world, like every time I've looked into some of the case studies or the projects that you speak about when you explain how to work regeneratively in the regenerative practitioner program, for example, or in your book with Pamela, it always feels like they're quite long-term, large projects that require a level of buy-in by some form of client, the developer or the wider community, that isn't in itself so easily come by. How do you make that engagement, and are all these projects where we're really, from the outset, people say, we're going to be with you for at least 2 years or 2.5, 3 years, and this is a process, and you better be ready for it and sign the dotted line that we're committed to this? Or have there also been kind of like, let's just engage and see where this is going type of approaches?
Some all of the above.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously we started out doing tiny projects. I mean, I started out as like a little gardener, and sort of built it over a very long period of time. And that in itself, I think, may be relevant because we were working from a technology, a fairly sophisticated set of principles, frameworks, ways of thinking. What I could learn on a very small scale then could be applied, you know, as I took on more and more ambitious, more and more complex projects. Right, the same underlying principles and ways of thinking applied. Just the complexity grew. Right, what you had to be able to embrace and understand got more and more difficult to hold, and so we had to grow into that. With regard to your question, it's a kind of an insider's question, Daniel. This thing about how do you engage somebody, and ideally you engage them with full consciousness of what they're getting into. Right. They may not know what's actually going to happen or how it's going to work, but they do need to know that this is a developmental process if it's to realize all of its potential. And
but doesn't that mean that you very, like, precisely because we live in a culture that tends to kind of be very solutioneering and problem solution implementation focused, when you then say, okay, no, we really want to do a series of interviews and really get close to the story of place through different perspectives of people involved in this area, and then begin a process of mirroring back to them what you've heard them speak to about the place, to get closer to a shared access to the deeper essence of what you're actually working with. Isn't that very often then quite a tension with a client like a developer of saying, well, we just wanted to build 400 units and we have problems with these guys who are saying that it's a wetland that we shouldn't touch, and we just want to resolve that issue. Like how do you dance with that? Or is that me projecting something into it that doesn't happen?
Oh no, it happens all the time. And to some extent, I think as we've matured, right, and gotten clearer and clearer about what we had to invent this as we went along. I couldn't speak with this level of confidence 15 years ago. So we went out and made every mistake you can make and learned from them, and, you know, had some successes and some, I don't know if they're ever failures, because everyone learns from the process. But more and more, it's like you can begin to discern who has the readiness, if you will, to recognize that just simply, you know, patching the hole or fixing the problem is not enough. And particularly, you know, so if they're kind of small or wildcat developers who just have one-off projects, that's less likely unless they're super inspired to want to pursue, they have some very large aspiration about the quality of what they're doing, right? It's the people who have really dedicated their lives to the work, so they're continually in the process of working on creating better and more successful projects. They're the ones where you have the potential to learn with them. So any individual project, no project is ever going to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfect, but every project can become an opportunity to move up to the next level. And so that's one way of answering your question. Another way of answering your question is we would not have gotten off the ground if this were not incredibly effective as a way to create successful projects. And often the effectiveness is kind of indirect. So for example, one of the core things that we articulate, now I'm speaking strictly in the arena of land development at the moment. Land development has become a really, degraded profession. It's highly, for the most part, it's highly degenerate. It's very destructive practice, and for the most part. And so people, for good reason, often are really resistant when a developer wants to come in and like do their fabulous, shiny, whatever it is, subdivision or office tower. And so one of the things that they are faced with is how do we engage a community that's resistant to what we want to do in a way that they will embrace it. Because if they embrace it, the project, for multiple reasons, the project's more likely to be successful, right? You've got kind of a welcoming environment. You have a willingness to work with the developer around approvals and all of that stuff. And those are the biggest risks and hurdles for a developer is, am I going to get the entitlement? Am I going to be approved to do this project in something that's more or less likely to be viable? And the key to all of this is that for a developer to successfully, this from our perspective, for a developer to successfully engage a community, the developer needs to be willing to join with the community to achieve its larger aspirations. So it's not about talking the community into supporting me. It's about joining with the community to help the community evolve, to become more of what it wants and needs to be. And that will always end up shaping what the project ends up being.
I mean, it sounds wonderful. And from everything that I've sort of been involved in, the thoughts that come up is that, again, there's a selection process of how do you, as you engage the community, you have to commit to what was most likely going to be a slower process, because it is actually listening to place and sourced from place and patterned by place, and that takes time to engage in a certain process before you pull out the plans and or the willingness to say, we started with these plans, and now that we've done this process, we're actually going to, despite the fact that we invested in having people work on these plans, rip them up and draw new plans. All of that is ultimately making things a bit more expensive. In the short term, probably has huge financial benefits in the long term, but it's precisely that where most projects today have the difficulty connecting the systemic longer vision and the systemic positive impacts with the conversation with one or two clients that just say, like, we have a pipeline and we want to get on to the next project. Any kind of...
Well, it's actually, it turns out to be just the opposite. That by it's, that truism that the Japanese introduced around go slow to go fast, that the more time you spend at the before you ever actually put a drawing down, right? the more time you spend understanding what this particular ecosystem, landscape, community is all about, right? What it's trying to become, how our project could relate to that, and then building relationships in the community with, you know, people who are respected in the community around, you know, this project being an investment in the community, the faster the whole process goes. Right? It can cut years off of years and just countless amounts of litigation off of a process. And we've seen that over and over and over again. And it takes a certain amount of sophistication on the part of a developer to understand this, right? The shift from doing a kind of linear process that's about basically manipulating public opinion, trying to manage the approvals process and so on, versus actually engaging with the community to become, a trusted investor in that community. And that, Bill Reed loves telling this story about a huge project that we were working on down in Viña del Mar in Chile, where they were looking at a minimum of 10 years being tied up in the courts with a high likelihood of the project. It was such a big, impactful project, of the project being disallowed at the end of that years and years of litigation. And he and Tim, within 2 weeks of community engagement, were able to completely turn that around. Right? So 10 years of litigation with a high likelihood of failure, 2 weeks of community engagement, which required the developer to say, okay, we're willing to actually engage, meaning this is not about, window dressing, going out there and pretending to people that we're your friends. This is about actually saying, we recognize that the deeper reason we want to develop this project is to bring life back to this city, right? And that we need to work with you, and we need to build relationships of trust, collaboration, purposefulness, to be able to accomplish that. And it's been transformational for the company, for the communities surrounding this massive project, for the city.
So earlier you spoke about these two streams coming together, and you then forming Regenesis. How did your work, since you were mainly in one of those two streams, how did your work change once the pieces that Pamela and folks brought in were added? What transformed?
Yeah. So I said that we kept bumping into this ceiling where the client group, whatever it was, the system that we were designing for, wasn't able to absorb and work with the designs, the actual functioning designs that we were giving them. And over time, what I came to realize is that the core thing that needed to be worked on was the way people were thinking. That it wasn't about any particular topic, any particular project, any particular problem or issue that people were trying to address, that it had to do with the way, the basic structure of the way they were thinking. And that was, if we wanted to move, we went into land development because we saw it having an enormous impact on the planet, and that if we could move the dial with regard to that, it could really make a difference. But over the years, I've become increasingly aware that where you move the dial is in the way people are thinking. And and the idea is to build capacity in people's thinking, everybody's thinking, so that the choices that we're making individually and collectively are choices that are regenerative, that are harmonious with, you know, with the planet, with place. One of the things that was invisible to me when I was practicing permaculture, and it's taken a long time for me to realize, is that the reason that was so difficult to do from within the permaculture kind of milieu was that it's functional in its orientation, right? And that's the way Mollison characterized it. He talked about functional landscapes, meaning as opposed to dysfunctional landscapes, right? Landscapes that have been robbed of their ability to function. And there was always some sense that we needed to pay attention to the social and cultural systems around that, but there wasn't a whole lot of understanding of how to work on that, right? Other than, let's see if we can apply these functional things that we've learned about designing landscapes to functionally designing community governance or whatever. And by focusing on function, what gets left out in there is the sense of being and of will, right? How do you actually cultivate or awaken collective will, political will? You know, if the will, this is kind of what's behind your question earlier, if the will isn't present, you know, it doesn't matter how great my design is. Right. You know, if the developer does not have the will to transform the way they are thinking and working, we can give them great ideas till the cows come home. It won't ultimately make any difference. And if people aren't able to kind of manage their own thinking, right, and see that as a critical place to intervene in the system, you remember Donella Meadows and Paradigms, right? That that if we don't develop the capacity of a community to like pause, reflect, right, and make better choices, you get things like the current response to the pandemic going on here in the US. So I don't want to make an artificial or false distinction between doing and being, or taking action, functional action, and thinking about it, right? The two are seamless, right? What I'm saying is that if we want to really transform the way we're working and inhabiting the planet, we need to become more intelligent about the actions that we take. There are a lot of people that are really gung-ho about going out and taking actions to fix all kinds of problems, clean up plastic waste in the oceans, and, you know, change transportation networks and all of that stuff. It's great, right? How do we use every action that we take to build our intelligence about systemic interventions?
And in that case, because one of the things that I found a lot of resonance with when digging deeper into the regenerative work is your conception of nested wholeness and what is place, like place from the place in front of me, but place being fractal in a way that whatever I do to the place in front of me also affects the entire nested wholeness, so it affects the planet. And then I just recently watched a presentation that you gave in I think Denver, Colorado in 2017, and where you actually spoke to the fact that this nestedness is why working regeneratively, even at the small scale with a small group of people in a small project, has efficacy or agency beyond that little project. How would you, like in terms of advising people, what scale, like is there a scale at which things get too complicated and too messy to really have feedback on what you're doing, and therefore there is actually some, like, in order to wisely steer into an evolving future that is uncertain, are we better off working at local and regional scales because feedback is quicker, simply for that reason, or do you think it's actually possible to have this approach apply at all scales of that nested wholeness?
It applies at all scales. So it's like, it's almost the right question, but not quite. Let me see if I can reframe it slightly. So you're right that the issue is complexity, but the reason it's an issue is because of our ability to manage complexity. And so there are, one of the reasons that we've focused from the very beginning on place is it was a scale of system that was complex enough that you can work systemically, I mean, and have huge systemic consequences. And yet it's small enough that people, first of all, can understand it. And more importantly, they can relate to it.
How would you define place then? Because place seems to be very different scales in this.
Yeah, everything's a place.
Yeah.
Right? So planet Earth happens to be a place within our solar system.
Yeah.
And so we tend to think about so we tend to work with this idea of place for most people in most contexts. We work on it at a kind of cultural scale, meaning what does the local culture recognize as being the natural boundary of what it takes into account. Right? So if you look at indigenous cultures, those things are laid out very clearly. You know, they're often laid out in terms of very specific landmarks, you know, and naturally occurring phenomena, rivers, mountains, and so on. Within urban systems, you know, there's people kind of know where their neighborhood boundary is. Within small towns, people know where the watershed boundary is. They may not they may not think about it much. They just sort of know. I live in this part of town, right? I live in this part of New Mexico, right? And I know immediately when I'm no longer in my part of New Mexico, because I grew up here. You just know. So a lot of what we do in a given context is try and understand or suss out where that kind of collective agreement is about this is ours, this is what we care about, you know, over there is over there, but here is here. And because if we can understand that and identify it, it's much, much easier to work on that question of will. What is it that people really love, really care about, really are willing to do something about if they saw that there was some possibility of doing it? So that's one way of thinking about place. Yeah. As different people are going to see that at different levels. Some people need to keep it very bounded and close in. Other people can see it in a very large sense. But the key is, can I relate to it? Can I actually feel caring for it? Not as an intellectual thing, but as something that I know and understand and am willing to dedicate myself to this. There's something else to say, and then once I've got that bounded, then I can understand its nestedness. I know how I'm fit inside of it, and I know how it fits, you know, in whatever the next system is. So if I just arbitrarily talk about my own town, I sort of know my town, which fits, is pretty well bounded by and defined by a particular watershed. And I know kind of where that watershed ends and how that fits within a region that we call northern New Mexico or north central New Mexico. And it's a very distinctive cultural, geological, ecological region. So I can immediately see, you know, how things fit together. This understanding of necessity, because we started out in I started out as a gardener, we started out in the field of land development, place became the thing that we focused on. And it's a really, really useful concept for working on the relationship of people and ecological systems, which is one of the huge topics in the world at the moment. However, the pattern behind it, the way of thinking behind it, applies to any field.
Just to make sure that I understood you there, I think because this is a really important point that for me it's been a journey, like I'm testing something out here. With my own work on Mallorca, the nested hole that, or the proximate hole that in order to shift something in the patterns on this island, drawn from the deep recognition of people here, that there's something unique about Mallorca that only Mallorca can give to the world, that is beyond what the knee-jerk response might be right now. Well, sun, sex, and sangria, or whatever they advertise cheap mass tourism with, but is the uniqueness of this particular location and its history and so on. Working with Mallorca, it's not always that I then have to say, oh, the nested hole, of course, is the Balearic Islands, and then it sits in Southern Europe or in Spain, and then it sits in Europe, which would be the entire sort of linear geographical nestedness. But it could be that working on Mallorca, you're actually working on the transformation of tourism, and that transformation of tourism then would also help the transformation of this island. Am I getting it? Or?
Sort of. I mean, if you're working on tourism,
yeah,
right, then working on tourism in Mallorca is a way of working on tourism generally. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you could say there is an entity called tourism in Mallorca, right, that you are choosing to care about, right, and you're choosing to evolve it. Just as there is an entity called land development in Mallorca that you're choosing to do something about. And so, and the same would be true of, I'm just trying to think of, wine, for example, right? That if your passion is wine, right, understanding and developing the way wine happens on Mallorca compared to wine in a larger Spanish or Southern European context, right? That wine's an easy example because it is inherently place-based, right? One of the things that makes wine so popular is that it actually can express the distinctiveness of a place. So when you work on wine, you're inherently also working on the place, if you're doing something other than mass-produced, you know, low-grade stuff. So the point is that what the pattern behind what we're doing around place is we're trying to understand who is this place, what is its essence, what is its unique character, because that's the thing people are relating to.
So would you say that, because like I looked up your bio briefly, and one of them that pops up is the one that you've got on the Regenesis webpage, and in it you say you specialize in holistic systems-based approach to understanding and building upon the complex human, natural, and economic relationships that create and sustain the vitality and viability of a place. That resonates very strongly with me. That's what I would say. I came to Mallorca to do that very thing, to learn how to do that. At the time, my experience of having tried to do similar things in experimental communities, eco-villages, or with small subgroups of the willing in a particular place, transition town groups and so on, led me personally at the time to an insight that to really create systemic change where you could leverage certain economics of scale and provide certain needs for a regional population brought me more and more, or closer and closer to regional scale of work. And that's why I moved to Mallorca 10 years ago, because I thought, okay, I want to commit to place anyway for my own sake and lifestyle and grounding. And Mallorca is a great place to study what one can do over the long term, humbly, to do systemic acupuncture and help create conversations and projects that slowly contribute to, hopefully in a catalytic way, to the positive transformation of a place. Is that in and of itself mistaken to some extent, to just say, because then the question there is, if you do that in one island of the Mediterranean, of course every other island will be different, but there is this question: to what extent can you transfer patterns and processes that you learn in one place bioregionally to then build networks with other islands that are on the same journey, and if at least form peer support groups that where people can we come across the similar problems, and this is how we work around them, but also to inspire anybody in the Mediterranean climate zone that at the regional scale it is possible to revitalize social relationships, economic relationships, and ecological relationships in such a way that everybody in that place wins, and you actually build resilience against climate change and all sorts of other uncertainties coming at us. In what way is that whole framing not aligned with the way that you would work regeneratively?
So you could tell that it wasn't aligned, right?
Well, I know you well enough, and we talk often enough that I know that.
So everything that you said makes sense. It's accurate, and it's characteristic of a lot of work that's being done out there around ideas like sustainability, resilience, even permaculture. Is a very characteristic way of thinking within a permaculture context, right? And so I'm going to try and slow this down so that we can really get to it if we can. That you're describing the system of Mallorca as an it, right? And you've made it, it's a great it, right? It's beautiful. It's, has these, it's just an amazing place, right? But looked at from that point of view, there are any number of islands you could have chosen to work on in a similar way, right? So if I thought about it in those terms, if I was really kind of shopping around and deciding which island am I going to do this on, I'd make lists and I'd sort of weigh the pros and cons, and I'd select the one that worked best for me. I'm guessing that in the 10 years that you've lived in Mallorca, something else has happened, and in fact may have already happened before you made the choice, which is you also feel drawn to it.
Yeah, I mean,
that is, you can actually relate to it. Right? And that relatedness, that sense of being at home, or I really care about this place, I love the relationships I'm building here. I love the way it feels to take that particular walk and see that mountain in that particular way. All of that stuff, you know, is happening. It's the distinction I mentioned earlier. There's a functional way of looking at it, and there's a being way of looking at it.
But for me, in my experience of how I've done this work now for 10 years, is that while I might have looked at functional issues and made lists of transformation in agriculture and energy and transport sector and urban development and all sorts of potential for transforming the dominant economy, which is, of course, tourism. But I feel that the way of actually working with it, for example, bringing a whole group of local people together working around the project where Ecovert, a Belgian detergent company, wanted to explore the production of soaps and cleaning products from local waste products. For me, and you mentioned this, alluded to this earlier, with some projects were successful and some projects, you basically didn't say that they also had their successes, even if maybe what the main aim wasn't successful, because they introduced a way of thinking with people. And in a similar way, I feel like a lot of the projects, both educational programs I've brought here, work with universities, work with this different like corporate clients, they all invite that kind of conversation, maybe less structured, but they create that conversation about what really matters about this place. How is this place unique? What is the potential here in terms of unused resources that we can connect, and unused connections between people that would unleash potential.
Can I pause you right there? So I was tracking you, and then you fell off a little cliff, right? All I'm trying to do is make explicit this distinction between functional development and development of being. Because our premise is that when you work them together, you get a completely different kind of result, a completely different level of effectiveness. And so I can think about the development of the potential of a place in terms of translating underutilized resources into some kind of productive new use, right? Or I can,
human relationship,
right? And that's a perfectly legitimate way of working on it, but it's one-sided. And the other way of looking at it is the potential of this place has to do with allowing its essence, its soul, to manifest more fully into the world. Right? And the reason and so you're right, it is, people do care about the places they live. And when you gather a group that has an interest in working something like the Zero Waste Initiative, it's there, it's implicit, right? And certain kinds of conversations will lift it up. But if the conversations are not conceived in a developmental way, then they don't actually build people's ability to conceptualize that aspect of the potential of what they're working on. And that ends up making a huge difference in terms of what they end up being able to enact.
This, like, because we've only got about 15 minutes left or so, I'm going to try something zooming out. This might or might not work, because it relates very much to this. You earlier briefly alluded to Donella Meadows and the Leverage Points paper. And I had a look, and I'm still working on, and I would love to have another conversation separate with, about this paper that you wrote recently with Carol Sanford on a framework for working on economics regeneratively. And in that, you also bring up the leverage points, and you bring up that places to intervene, and you frame it in a way that she did in her first version of that paper, where the highest point is to intervene at the level of the paradigm. And at that point, when she wrote it, she framed it around that's the fundamental sort of Kuhnian paradigm shift, and everything else changes. The whole understanding of the system changes. And when she first wrote it, she did the same thing as you do in that paper, which is to say, paradigms are mutually exclusive. So once you're in that new paradigm, you see things completely differently. But Dana herself, in the later part of her life, then rewrote that paper and added another level to it, which is the highest leverage point is moving beyond paradigms. And what I think she was alluding to, and bringing that close to regeneracist language, would be that what she was saying is that in order to pick people up and keep the conversation going as you dance with complexity and systems, you keep all the levels of work open at the same time. And you can actually work, and I'm noticing that, of course, the long apprenticeship and practice to really work purely regeneratively and train your mind and your ability to do it is a long, deep journey, and I have a long way to go there. But I guess where I sometimes bump into wanting to keep learning from those technologies and how to apply them, but then where I don't see eye to eye, or where there's a different perspective maybe, is that I actually believe that, as you say yourself, that all the other levels of work are also really important, and they all, and for a system to stay viable and evolving and all that, it needs to actually do all the levels of work. And so for me, the question is, when working in these ways, don't we over time bring, sometimes in the right moment with the right people for the right amount of time, the deeper regenerative level work into the conversation as we capture people and engage them? Because some of the finance flows and decision makers might not quite be ready for that conversation yet, but so they get drawn in to a project that is actually working on maintain level or improve level, but is keeping, at least aspirationally and in terms of energetic, holding the regenerate, like the evolutionary dimension, the developmental dimension open. Does that make any sense whatsoever? Like, do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, and so here's how I would say it back to you, that with my own little twist on it, that we tend to work within the regenesis, frame. We talk about 5 levels of work, right? All of which need to be present if an entity is to remain vital, viable, and capable of evolution. Yeah. And the bottom level is stabilized, right? So if you get a wound, it can heal, right? The body's, you get a flu, the body needs to heal itself. But once you've got that, then you can move into these other levels. And being able to understand and think and work from those different levels of work requires development, right? So people enter at various levels in terms of the existing capacity they've developed, what they're just naturally able to do. And the idea is to continually help them extend and expand their thinking so that they can hold the whole of a dynamic, living, changing, evolving operating system. So obviously, I mean, regeneration has to do, the way I image it, regeneration is about going back to the essence of something and bringing it forward in a new way as the world is changing, right? So if you keep on doing what you've always done and the world is changing around you, most things become decreasingly viable, right? So they have to sort of take that core genius, whether it's genetic or, in terms of essence or nature or character, and sort of bring it into a new situation, a new context. And that's how we grow and develop as human beings, from infancy on to the end of our lives. So yes, of course, it's completely appropriate to engage people where they're at. It would be disrespectful not to engage people where they're at, while holding, it's equally disrespectful to not hold the assumption and expectation that they can grow from where they're at, whoever they are.
Yeah.
Everyone, this is why it's completely appropriate to involve children in decision-making processes, that have to do with the body politic. Is completely appropriate, right? Understanding that they're at a certain stage in their development, but they also need to be growing along with the rest of us. The way I hear sort of your comment on Donella Meadows' evolution in her thinking,
Mm-hmm.
the way I hear that is a recognition that that beyond paradigm, right, there is an ability to look at where and how paradigms are sourced, right? So we talk about paradigm as kind of the frame of reference within which we live, sort of how we frame and understand reality. But it's possible to step out of that and say, okay, what is the process by which reality framing is occurring? Right? And what do I need to be able to observe in myself and observe in my cosmos to be able to look at that? And so I was thinking about this coming into this conversation, that these levels of work is not the whole game, right? There are levels of work below and levels of work beyond what we talk about. Regeneration is a particular level of work. It's not the end of the story. It just happens to be a level of work that we collectively need to learn how to do. And there's not a huge capacity out there, yet to be able to think at that level. There's not even that much capacity to be able to think at the evolution of systems level.
But when, briefly coming back to Donella's point there, I'm wondering whether what she was trying to get at, or the way I've often interpreted her, is that yes, it's understanding the very participatory nature of mind in mattering, literally, like in creating reality, bringing forth a world together in relationship, all those kind of frames that Maturana and Varela and all those people brought into this more dynamic evolutionary way of thinking about evolving systems. And I believe that she was also speaking to a more developmental approach in terms of the kind of stages of human development, Piaget or Gibbs or spiral dynamics or Wilber, or whatever you want to use as a frame, that we also need to keep the older paradigms, so to speak, healthy in their expression, because as people evolve and gain deeper and deeper understanding of the participatory nature of the world, as long as we still teach Newtonian physics and stuff, the predisposition to fall into this object-subject separation world and all that will be there. And so we need to have the paradigms all offer their unique and useful contribution as a perspective of participation in continuously transforming wholeness, but not the perspective. So learning, like taking, even if they are, because in that paper that you wrote with Carol, you say they're incommensurable, but that means in one moment you can't hold two paradigms at once. but you can learn from one perspective, and then you can shift perspective and learn from the other perspective, and then you can build wise action in dynamic wholeness, in understanding that each perspective has blind spots, and so being informed by multiple perspectives might offer paths to wiser action. That's how I understood that point.
Okay, well, I think it's an interesting thing to investigate. I'm skeptical.
What makes you skeptical?
Well, because I mean, if I just look at myself personally,
Mm-hmm.
I'm perfectly capable of dropping down to a value return paradigm. I do it daily, right? It's like, what's in it for me? You know, you want this, what's in it for me? Why would I bother, engaging in this interaction? And my experience of stepping out of that kind of level of consciousness is that when I have stepped out of it, I view having been in it as regressive, meaning that it's not that I'm no longer in exchange with my environment. It's just that what's in it for me is no longer, it's no longer a question that needs to orient or, shape the choices that I'm making. So I don't mean to be belittling or denigrating people operating from different paradigms. I mean, we're surrounded by people operating from different paradigms. It's not that. It's that my sense is and it's not about perspective, right? It's about which reality am I moving through in my life, right? And to what extent have I developed my ability to operate from within a reality that is life generating. So again, for me, I kind of get where your question is coming from, and I can see how you're trying to create a parallel between that and the idea of levels of work, all of which need to be, healthy and dynamically related and so on. But it's not my experience that it works that way. That I experience myself almost as a different person when I'm operating from a higher order paradigm. Right? The me who shows up, the I who shows up, is a different nature of I.
And I guess for me it comes from an experience of having tried to build bridges between people who come from very different perspectives for a very long time, and that having had that experience, that sometimes you just need to, it doesn't mean that you yourself change your being state from like suddenly collapsing an understanding of dynamic participatory wholeness where mind is involved in shaping matter, down to, oh, now I'm talking to somebody who's trapped in a Newtonian physics paradigm, so therefore I collapse into that too. But I can use my language and even build 3 steps on a 10,000 step journey with them, using that language.
That's totally necessary. That's this word developmental that we just throw around and throw around and throw around. That's what that's supposed to mean.
Yeah,
right?
that's what
I'm countering someone who I experience as being kind of trapped in too narrow a cage, right? It would be disrespectful of me to write them off as being just that's it. Mm-hmm. Trapped is their destiny, right? So how do I engage them in a conversation that allows them to tap into what it is they really want to accomplish, and to find ways to begin to move toward that. We talk about that in terms of caring. We sometimes have this conversation around the difference between compassion, which is wanting people, seeing that people are suffering and wanting to remove their suffering, and caring, which is seeing the inherent potential in every living being, every human being, every living being, and really wanting to help them express that, because it's a drive in all of us, right? And so if our paradigm or our way of viewing the world or our way of thinking is like a barrier to being able to express that potential, then it's our responsibility to one another to help one another dismantle those barriers. Not everybody is particularly driven to dismantle those barriers. Not everybody's interested in these conversations, but a lot of people are. I mean, it's amazingly, I think I experience it as deeply respectful, and I think other people experience it as deeply respectful when someone is willing to listen deeply enough into what they aspire to be and to become, to want to help them. Yeah. It's not about imposing my worldview. It's about trying to see what it is that people are trying to accomplish, not just material, but through their lives, through the meaning in their lives, and to commit to helping them.
You've modeled exactly that with just giving me the time for this conversation of the last 70, 80 minutes. I'm a slow learner, it seems, but I think we got to some interesting, important points for me to. There's just, I'm noticing how some things trigger me around the clear definition of border. This is regenerative and this isn't, and it feels that there's so many friends in the work that are doing wonderful work and want to dig deeper into understanding how to be more effective in working regeneratively, that I often find that I want to make the bridge for them easier, to not feel just because you're working bioregionally or you're working with biomimicry, you haven't got it yet, or it sometimes comes across to people like that. But I see how every time I have conversations with you, or with Bill or with Pamela, I learn huge amounts. So thank you so much for this, and I wish we could continue, but I think you have another call, and maybe we'll do another one sometime soon.
Thanks, Daniel. Yep. Thanks for doing this. It's really fun. It's a great way to wake up.
Yeah, for me, it's big because when the hot time of the year now, I'm noticing that these conversations with Americans that are fresh early in the morning, it's still cool outside, and me here sweating in Mallorca, slightly imbalanced because I'm kind of at the low point of the day. But this was wonderful, and I just feel that these conversational recordings, I've also had some feedback from people. They really help people get into this in a different way than kind of asking people to give a half-hour lecture and so on. So thank you so much for being available, and I hope we'll do another one, and I'm sure we'll see each other soon in another call.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Ciao.